Rudolph Kipling, the author of The Jungle Book, wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden in 1899. Whether it was satire or not, we don't know, but people certainly took the poem and used it to excuse themselves for imperialism. He wrote, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness, unflettered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." Rudolph Kipling was an English writer who spent his youth in British colonial India. The speaker in this poem urged the whites of Western countries to establish colonies for the good of the inferior people of the world. Whether Kipling actually supported this idea is not clear, but his poem was used to justify it. Proponents justified European colonization using a variety of explanations, from a belief in nationalism, a desire for economic wealth, a sense of religious duty, and a belief they were biologically superior. These various motives for establishing overseas empires, a policy called imperialism, would lead to conflicts in Asia and a scramble to colonize Africa. In Western Europe, revolutions, the rise of nationalism, and the creation of nation-states characterized much of the 1800s. With a strong sense of identity and loyalty to a state, many world powers boldly asserted authority over other territories. Building an empire in Asia or Africa was one way for a country to assert its national identity in the global arena. Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands would long possess overseas colonies. After losing its American colonies, Britain looked for new lands to open to settlement. In 1788, the first British settlers arrived in the colony of New South Wales on the east coast of the island continent of New Holland, or today's Australia. Britain was also expanding its influence in South Asia, gradually taking control of India from the East Indian Company. By 1857, Britain controlled the entire Indian subcontinent, Ceylon or Sri Lanka, Burma or Myanmar, and the Malay states, which included Singapore, and parts of Borneo in Southeast Asia, were also under British control. France compensated for its humiliating defeat by Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War by expanding its overseas territories. It had already occupied Algeria in North Africa, New Caledonia and other islands in the South Pacific, Senegal in Western Africa, and Indochina in Southeast Asia. Italy and Germany were newly unified states in the late 19th century. Each wanted colonies not only for economic and strategic reasons, but also for prestige. However, neither began acquiring an empire until the mid-1880s. Spain had led the quest for colonies in the first wave of imperialism during the 16th and 17th centuries. Its power was greatly diminished by the 19th century. It did not play a dominant role in this second wave of imperialism. Japan asserted its nationalist pride through incursions into Korea. This irritated China, a country that had exerted a strong presence in Korea for centuries. The conflict grew into the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. Japan's victory gave it control of Korea. Japan also seized Taiwan, which was known as Formosa, from the time of the Portuguese colonization in the 16th century until the end of World War II. The Kipling quotation that opens this video epitomized the condescending attitude shared by imperialism proponents. Referring to colonized people as children reflected how colonizers saw themselves as benevolent protectors on a civilizing mission rather than invaders. The attitudes of Europeans towards others were a form of racism. Colonial powers generally believed that they were inherently superior to those they subjugated. Pseudoscientists, people who present theories as science that are actually incompatible with the scientific method, strengthened these attitudes. Legitimate science was also subverted to support imperialism. British scientist Charles Darwin's 19th century theory of evolution by natural selection started that over 1 million years biological competition had weeded out the weaker species in nature, and that the fittest species were the ones that survived. Some thinkers adapted Darwin's theory of biological evolution to society, creating the theory known as social Darwinism. While Darwin himself was not a social Darwinist, advocates used the survival of the fittest theory to argue that the spread of European and U.S. power proved the biological superiority of Europeans. Writers and politicians then used social Darwinism to justify further imperialism by powerful countries. Based on a preconceived technological superiority over indigenous societies, colonial powers felt justified in superimposing aspects of their own cultures on their colonies. For administration purposes, many colonies combined into a single colony with different people and different cultures who often spoke different languages. Colonizers introduced their own language, which helped to unify these often diverse colonies. They also introduced their political, educational, and religious institutions and exerted other cultural influences on architecture and recreational activities. Missionaries were among the most tireless civilizing influences, like the Spanish and Portuguese Catholic missionaries who combined conquest and evangelicalism during the Age of Discovery. British Protestant missionaries from the 18th to the 19th century also participated in colonizations. Critics charged that missionaries supported imperialism by persuading people to give up their traditional beliefs, such as ancestor worship, and adopt the faith of most Europeans, Christianity. This change in religion could pave the way for others who were more focused on economic gain. In response, missionaries pointed out that they commonly combined religious with humanitarian efforts. Missionaries often set up schools for instruction in religion that also taught secular subjects, which prepared students to become teachers, lawyers, and other professionals. Many missionaries provided improved medicines and medical care. And some missionaries, most famously David Livingstone from Scotland, worked in sub-Saharan Africa to end the illegal slave trade. Some people believe the ideological motivations were more accurately justifications for pursuing economic motives. Seeking ways to maximize profits, companies chartered by the British, French, and Dutch governments signed commercial treaties with local rulers in India, East Africa, and the East Indies. These treaties gave the Europeans the right to establish trading posts and forts to protect their interests. Originally, these companies formed primarily for the spice trade. Many companies had quasi-governmental powers, raising armies and conquering territory to form colonies. As Industrial Revolution transformed European economies, the desire for the sources for raw materials and markets for manufactured goods provided by colonies enticed imperial powers to increase their expansion. Imperial powers often competed with one another over the best potential resources, markets, and trade, as demands for low-wage labor, access to markets, and control of natural resources increased. English monarch granted the East Indian Company a royal charter in 1600, giving it a monopoly on England's trade with India. After driving the Portuguese out of India, the company traded primarily in cotton, silk, indigo, and spices. Eventually, the EIC expanded its activities from the Persian Gulf to East Asia. By the beginning of the 18th century, it had become a major agent of British imperialism in India, and after 1834, it became the British government's managing agency in India. Starting in 1620, the EIC engaged in the slave trade, and during the 19th century, it illegally exported opium to China in exchange for tea. The East Indian Company is often referred to as the English East Indian Company, or after 1607, the British East Indian Company, to distinguish it from the Dutch East Indian Company. That's a lot of companies. In 1602, the Dutch government gave the Dutch East Indian Company, or the VOC, a monopoly on trade between the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa and the Straits of Magellan at the southern tip of South America. The VOC concentrated on the islands around Java, replacing the Portuguese who had controlled the region. Corruption and debt led the government to take control of the company's possessions in 1799, creating the new Dutch East Indies, which is today known as Indonesia. After the Industrial Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was the leading economic power throughout the first half of the 19th century and already had a sizable colonial empire. Its colonies provided raw materials such as cotton, wool, jute, vegetable oils, and rubber for its factories, as well as foodstuffs such as wheat, tea, coffee, cocoa, meat, and butter for its growing cities. Its colonies, especially settler colonies such as Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, also provided markets for British manufactured goods. As the Second Industrial Revolution progressed, other nations began to challenge Britain's economic lead. They looked to Asia, Africa, and the Pacific to expand their markets, provide raw materials for their factories, and food for their growing urban populations.